Okay, lecture 10, chapter 1 and 2. Looks like we're starting to kind of get an idea as to why the author at this time has chosen to recreate, or at least request us to consider that the maize story is a story that has the components of which we can attach ourselves, so that our identities feel more connected to this place. Because if you remember, we are in a country where the master narrative is the one about the immigrant, democracy, liberty, etc., while the one we come from is usually one made up in, like for Mexico, for example, the glorious Aztec Mexica past and the birth of a mestizo nation. That's their master narrative. But what he's trying to tell us is, no, the maize story is much older, more beautiful, and it does not exclude, which is very important. The U.S. master narrative has, particularly when it comes to brown people, it puts them in a permanent category of immigrants, despite the fact of their connection to the territories historically before the United States was born. The Mexican narrative only focuses on one particular ethnic group and pits other ethnic groups against each other in a historical context, like Tlaxcaltecas versus the Aztecs, Tlaxcaltecas helping the Spanish, etc. And it dismisses the plurality, the multi-ethnic plurality that it is Mexico. And just the 68 languages alone tell us the fact that it is a multi-ethnic nation. So in chapter 1, we see how he explains to us how this process works, where the nation's reinventing itself. See, the individual has a story, and then so our brains are apt to create a story, including put us at the front of the story and makes us the good guy. Okay, only when we mature we begin to recognize that maybe we're just being human and we commit errors along the way. Now we also have a family story, right? Your interactions with your uncle, your auntie, your grandma, your mom, your dad, etc. Right, that's also a story, and you know a version of that story, while the person who is interacting with you has their version of the story. Now the community has a story. There's a little more fluidity in this story in the community. Now there's East LA, East Los Angeles, primarily a Mexicano, Chicano neighborhood, has a story as a community, that changes over time. Other parts of the Southwest have similar stories. Hillsborough has a story. It's a mangled story, right, between Oregon as a territory and eventually Washington County. That has the story. But then we elevate that to the national level. So nations, like individuals, also need a story where it brings people together. But this story of the United States, what it does, it on paper or as an idea, it seems to bring people together. We're an immigrant nation, and everybody's pursuing the American dream. But the reality is that that reality doesn't exist necessarily for everybody, for a lot of people. So that narrative doesn't really work that well, but it's still imposed. The Mexican story is the same thing. It leaves the native people out of it. It prioritizes this mestizo myth of sorts. Okay, so Rodriguez is telling us, well, then if these stories are putting people in hierarchies, leaving people out, then the maize story is the one that makes the most sense. So in chapter 1, he just kind of gives us the sort of his reasoning as to why the maize story is the one that we should consider, because of all the outcomes of participating in the other stories, the other master narratives, whether the U.S. or the Mexican one. So that's kind of what I want you to sort of pay attention to in chapter 1. I'm going to skip off to chapter 2 because we are moving to the 5-minute realm. Now, here he begins to give us another piece of the master narrative story of maize, which begins with Quetzalcoatl. And Quetzalcoatl is both a mythical figure, but he is also a human figure. So we begin to see pieces that are to have a master narrative. It has to be tied somehow loosely or solidly to reality. It can't just be pure myth. And of course, it has other components like the cultural component, the ritualistic component of it. And all right, there's things that you do as an individual that you believe, which are tied to myth. There's rituals that participate every day that make you who you are. Like you have to do those things that make you who you are. And then when you enter a relationship, you find out like, oh, they do things differently than I do. And then you try to find some middle ground. If not, each one respect those particular rituals. And of course, that manifests into a reality, an interactive reality. So here, the narrative has to work like that for a people, it has to work like that for a nation. And so the Chicano people who have established themselves since the beginning of time, that's the reality. Not 1492, not 1848, not 1969. The Chicano people have had a long process. In modernity, as of recently, the Aztlan narrative was the first one to be experimented with. And I think I'll talk about a little bit more about that in chapter 3 for now. But for now, let's get back to chapter 2. So in chapter 2, what we're seeing is this competition, right? So we have the Quetzalcoatl, because that's what the author's doing. He's kind of like telling you, here's the outcome of participating in master narratives, modern master narratives, U.S. or Mexico, doesn't matter. And then he gives us an element of the maize, and then he goes back. Here's the outcome of the master narrative in the U.S. For example, the master narrative of dismissing the native experience completely ignoring it, shutting it into history books about the displacement and the violence that took place to be able to displace native people. And these native people are connected, and maize is the key how they're connected. So their stories are similar of displacement, exploitation, mutilation, which is encompassed in the word violence. Their story is also the master, which is part of the master U.S. master narrative, is also is connected to their mythical historical connection, which is the Christian one, right? And the Europeans Europeans were Christianized by Middle Easterners and Northern Africans at one point, and via the Romans. The Romans adopted Christianity, and then they went ahead and began to impose it as a state religion, as they control all these western parts of Europe and other parts of, including all the way through, right? Because Russia became Christianized too, their own version of Christianity. So the U.S. master narrative is also tied to this mythical story tied to Christianity, the Judeo-Christian belief system. Again, the author brings up, well, we too, our narrative is also old, if not older than that, and maize is the clue. And it's just a matter of us looking for those clues to reconnect, so that we can now begin to feel like the true people of this land. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden we become property holders. There's still this master narrative that still has control of the social, political, economic environment. But at the same time, psychologically, you start contemplating that you're not really a foreigner. That there's part of you, if not a lot of you, including your connection through maize, because you experience it every day. You're in contact with it every day. And it is the gift that keeps on giving across the Americas and the planet. By adopting the maize narrative, and the author calls it the contra-narrative, you begin to challenge that. And so the master narrative no longer controls you and puts you in your place as the eternal immigrant. Instead, now you can walk more confidently about these strong ties you have historically to all these lands. And it sounds far fetched until you actually talk to the native people of the Northern Territories here in the United States who say Mexicans are native people. And it usually catches the first time a colonized native, de-Indianized, de-indigenized native off guard. But it has to do with letting go of the master narrative of being the eternal immigrant who's taking jobs and reinserting yourself through the path of the maize, the mother maize, to reconnect with other people that have experienced a similar situation at one point in history, and if even might even be still experiencing it. Okay, thank you. Talk to you soon.